Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Bruxford. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at the University of North Texas. It's my honor to welcome you all here this morning. This looks like a great conference. We have speakers who knew Willis Conover. We have speakers who are archivists at related archives and museums, and we have speakers to talk about jazz diplomacy and the Cold War. It's going to be an interesting day. I'm glad you all could make it. Willis Conover broadcast for Voice of America for 41 years. Because it was Voice of America, it went to the rest of the world. He's not as well known at home as we would like, but we can work on that. And I think we are working on that all the time. His collection is the largest individual collection at the University of North Texas. And Maristella pointed out that fittingly, the only larger collections are from radio stations. So it all works together nicely. We had a grant in 2015, a Grammy Foundation grant, which always makes us happy, to be able to put a lot of the interviews and recordings from the collection in the UNT Digital Library. So after today, you might want to go take a look and see what else you can contact and what else you can learn about him and about jazz through his collection. You're welcome to come anytime and see the collection here. Probably have to wait a few more months, but we'll get there and we'd love to see you. So welcome everyone. Have a great day. I'm going to be kind of in and out today, but I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm delighted to welcome you to the UNT Music Library's first ever Willis Conover Symposium. It's remarkable to have so many Conover experts and enthusiasts in one place, and we thank you for making the time to join us here today. As we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which UNT and UNT's library are built and where the Willis Conover collection is housed. Our campus stands on land that historically belonged to the Wichita, Caddo, Kickapoo, Tawakoni, Waco, and Kichi tribes. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to work to understand our place within that history. As this event has developed over the past year, it has been clear that it would be an important moment for us to recognize and further document the career of Willis Conover, whose influence is immeasurable. Indeed, I need not impress upon this audience the importance of him and his career to radio, jazz, or US diplomacy. But I can impress upon you the importance of his collection to the University of North Texas. When Morris Martin, then head of the UNT Music Library, was approached in 1996 by the Willis Conover Jazz Preservation Foundation about potentially receiving the Conover collection, we were not without significant jazz collections already, both archival and commercial. We had extensive documentation from Gene Hall and especially Leon Breeden that already provided a wealth of information about the jazz studies program's birth and growth here at UNT, as well as a parallel narrative of the development of jazz education more broadly. Our collection of charts from Stan Kenton and photographs from his publicist, Noah Wetter, have long documented a musician whose career reflected the trajectory of big band jazz over 4 decades. We also had unreleased Ellington recordings in the Rhodes Baker collection, dance band charts from local radio station WFAA, extensive commercial jazz recordings in a variety of formats, and much more. But none of these collections is nearly as comprehensive as the huge variety of materials in the Conover collection. When the collection arrived at UNT in an 18-wheeler truck, it was a near complete encapsulation of one man's life. We received the majority of his home's content, excluding furniture and clothing, as well as the contents of his office that were not property of the Voice of America. We grappled with sorting through the mundane, such as a particularly unpleasantly smelling jar filled with a variety of old vitamin supplements, to the fascinating like beautiful and delicate watercolor Christmas cards from the White House. We delighted in coming across research materials, such as playlists that document the plans for and revisions to his shows and his correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft. His own creative writing, personal papers, photographs, additional correspondence, realia, and more raised the prospect of intense research opportunities. All of these materials help the researcher to navigate the context of what makes up the core of the collection, the recordings, of which we received over 22,000. The recordings, and especially the interviews with most of the jazz luminaries of his era, are the heart of the Conover collection. I'm sure Maristella will cover the contents of many of these interviews, and we're pleased that a significant portion of them are available for streaming in our digital library. Conover's distinctive and mellifluent voice draws our readers into enlightening conversations that entertain as much as they document. These interviews highlight perspectives from performers and writers that serve as a crucial primary source document to facilitate understanding of the motivations and inspirations of the interview subjects. The commercial recordings in the collection have also been significant, especially to our local students. These include a broad selection of international releases we would likely not otherwise have access to, and they have circulated extensively to students and faculty over the years. His editorial notes on many of these offer clues to his own reception and use of them, and help users to understand the roles that specific recordings played in Conover's process of discovering new artists and sharing their work with his listeners. The Willis Conover collection serves as a tribute to this man, his intellect, and his expertise, while simultaneously presenting a treasure trove of educational opportunities for students and scholars. We're honored to be custodians of such a collection and honored that you have joined us today to explore the man at the center of this collection. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Susanna and Diane. And so to start the day, I'm gonna share my screen, and I'm calling this initial presentation Conover 101. So again, it's a joy to be able to present this event virtually. Multiple facets of Willis Conover's story attract interest from many angles. Just to name a few, there's jazz, public diplomacy, the history of the Cold War, race relations, and even science fiction. So this first presentation is an overview of Conover's life in order to provide background and context for the presentations to follow. And as a librarian, of course, I'm going to discuss where you can find some of these collections, especially with regard to our holdings at UNT. First, for a bit of family history, Conover is one anglicized form of the Dutch name Van Couwenhoven. The Conovers in the United States, as well as the Crownovers, are descended from Wolfert Gerritse van Couwenhoven, one of the original Dutch colonists in New Nederland, which includes present-day New York. The motto on the family crest says, Sequitur Victoria Fortis, translated as victory follows the brave. Conover's father, Willis Conover Sr., made his career in the military. A May 1st, 1914 article in the Buffalo Evening News reprints Willis Sr.'s letter home describing his experiences in the battle and subsequent American occupation of Veracruz, Mexico, the previous month, now a largely forgotten conflict in the United States. Willis Sr. and Frances Harris were married on February 23, 1920. Willis Clark Conover Jr. was born on December 18, 1920, 100 years ago next week, in Buffalo, New York. While both sides of the family had roots in the Buffalo area, Willis's family relocated frequently in his earliest years due to his father's military career. Conover later recalled that he attended 25 different schools by the time he graduated high school. His earliest correspondence in our collection at UNT begins in January of 1931, age 10, tracing what appears to be an extended stay in Puerto Rico, with the first letter in August and the second in September. He was clearly advanced for his age as a writer, surely in part by natural ability, partly since his mother had been a teacher, and partly by necessity to maintain connections after each relocation. It is through his correspondence that we gain insights into Conover's personality in his early years, much earlier than for many subjects whose archives become biographical resources. In fact, in a letter dated July 12, 1933, Conover Sr. said to his son, "I must say you are some letter writer." Those of you who are familiar with Conover's story know where the letter writing is going, but I want to pause there to discuss Conover's musical background and related development. Conover Sr.'s older sister, Mary Louise Conover, enjoyed a career as a locally successful contralto and soprano and as a singing teacher. During the mid-1920s, she appeared regularly on Buffalo radio station WGR. An excerpt from Conover's 1994 oral history with Billy Taylor for the Smithsonian Institution's Jazz Oral History Project lends context. As he explained, since my father's sister was a professional singer, and she was singing in a church, not hymns, but oratorios and cantatas by Bach and Gounod and Bizet, she got me to join the choir, that is, before my voice changed. So that was my first real exposure to music. Two letters from 1932 find a young Willis at St. Paul Choristers' Camp in the Catskills. A letter in April of 1934 from Ralph A. Harris, choirmaster at St. Paul's in Brooklyn, addresses the conundrum of Willis's changing voice, urging him to continue until the end of the season, but to omit uncomfortable notes. Still, his choir career seems to have ended when his voice changed. And speaking of that voice, it seems that when he lost his singing voice, he gained his radio voice, though the lessons on breath, diction, and tone control seem to have followed him through life. Conover also explains to Billy Taylor, when I was a high school freshman, an upperclassman wrote a skit that took place, presumably in a radio station, and because my voice had changed, they gave me the role of the radio announcer to read phony commercials and so forth. So when it was all over, people came up to me and said, hey, you sound like the real thing, a real radio announcer. So, and he continued, well, you know, when you're about whatever I was, about 14 or something, well, it sticks in your mind. Elsewhere in that interview, he notes that he spent his freshman year at Western High School in DC, now the Duke Ellington School of the Arts, which is certainly fitting in hindsight. But Conover's adolescence brings us to where letter writing really took off. Writing, as his correspondents never came across like they were talking to a child. It is not surprising that Conover was also a voracious reader. Reading also had the benefit of being a reliable and portable activity amid so many disruptions and relocations. Conover Sr. had retired from the Army as a captain in 1934, and the family settled in Cambridge, Maryland, but that didn't bring contentment for Conover. In Lovecraft at Last, a book Conover published in the 1970s to tell the story of his correspondence with sci-fi and horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, he further explained, my father was an Army officer. He expected me to become one too. In due time, I was to attend the Citadel. But I had lived on enough Army posts and seen enough regimentation to know that it wasn't for me. Early in life, therefore, I retreated into myself. I could read almost as soon as I could talk. The stories I most enjoyed were those that took me to fantastic worlds where the only restraints were the limits of imagination. The social limitations imposed by my $50 a week allowance, not to mention my shyness, made it all but impossible to hang out with my teenage neighbors. Dating girls was most painfully out of the question, and so my correspondence, whether glamorous or not, became far more real and important to me than anyone else. His correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft is well known in those literary circles, but even that is only the tip of the iceberg. This slide shows a science fiction fan publication, a zine in today's terms, from his collection, a picture of author Nixon Dialhis with his wife and daughter, and a letter from H.P. Lovecraft to Conover. Emboldened by getting his first letter to Astounding Stories published at the age of 14, he continued to write to science fiction magazines. The Internet Speculative Fiction Database, or ISFDB, traces numerous letters by Conover, beginning with the August 1935 issue of Astounding Stories, and continuing in that publication, along with Amazing Stories, Helios, and Weird Tales, among others. The correspondence with Lovecraft began in the summer of 1936. Their exchange over the next few months survives, thanks to Conover, as what writer S.T. Joshi terms a poignant, even wrenching testimonial to the friendship between a middle-aged and dying man and the young boy who idolized him. Lovecraft, for his part, had no idea of Conover's age until he told him. To make a long story short, because we have decades of jazz history to discuss as well, Conover's meteoric rise in the sci-fi world eventually ran into artistic differences with his co-editor, not to mention his grief at Lovecraft's death. But he also struck a friendship with an even more mysterious writer, Nixon Dialhis of Salisbury, Maryland, whose origins have been a challenge to trace because he mythologized his own existence with the same creativity that he put into his stories. In any case, Conover struck up a rapport with Dialhis similar to that which he had with Lovecraft, and even hitchhiked to Salisbury from Cambridge to meet Dialhis and his wife Nataliani. Works by Nixon Dialhis and his correspondence with his wife survive in Conover's collection, along with some photos, which are exceedingly rare. It seems reasonable to speculate that the Dialhis connection informed Conover's decision to attend what is now Salisbury University. He appears only to have stayed there for a year, during which time he began substituting on the campus radio station, WSAL, whose call letters have long since been reassigned. Soon after, Conover entered a radio announcing contest in Washington, D.C., and won a position at WTBO in Cumberland, in Western Maryland. Conover rose in the ranks of WTBO to chief announcer and music director with a salary of $37.50 a week, $37.50, which adjusted for inflation is just over $700. He enjoyed modest success as well in the local theater scene and played Albert in an early incarnation of the sitcom Ethel and Albert alongside the groundbreaking writer and actress Peg Lynch, to whom he was briefly engaged. It was during this time that jazz finally caught his attention. Conover credited Billy May's arrangement of Ray Noble's Cherokee with getting him into jazz, an interest cemented by his discovery of Duke Ellington. The local record shop owner introduced him to Downbeat magazine, and Willis Conover was on his way to becoming the jazz specialist the world came to know in the mid-50s. In the 1994 interview with Billy Taylor, Conover explained that if his musical background were compared to a tree, Ellington would be the trunk. But before it was time for jazz, it was time for aircraft maintenance. Before the war, Conover took on one of his first side projects, narrating several training films for the Army, including this one on aircraft engines. Contracts in his collection made it possible to find this one on YouTube. Conover himself was drafted and joined the Army in September of 1942, where his experience interviewing people on the radio led to a position as a classification specialist at Fort Meade, interviewing new recruits to match them with suitable duties. And here's some circa 1940 Conover. Hopefully this audio will come through.
The mixture is said to be lean.
Long pauses.
The imperfect distribution of fuel to the various cylinders is represented by excess oxygen in the right cylinder. By increasing the richness above the chemically correct mixture, power increase in the leaner cylinders usually exceeds the power loss.
And so on. So while still in the Army, he caught a major break at the Stage Door Canteen in Washington, D.C., simply by seeing a need and doing something about it. The music which someone else had picked out for an evening of dancing was just not cutting it. Conover selected and played replacements which were so well received that he landed a part-time position at WWDC in Washington, D.C., working weekends at the station and spending the rest of the week with the Army. By the time of his honorable discharge from the Army at the rank of technical sergeant in February of 1946, Conover was wearing a variety of hats at WWDC, not only in music, but as one of the title characters in Hazel and Harold, a comedy series that seems pretty clearly derivative of Ethel and Albert. Many recordings of this program survive in the UNT collection, with some in the UNT Digital Library. Conover pushed ahead with his passion for jazz amid other duties as assigned. He became a popular local personality and built a formidable network of friends and contacts in the jazz world that he would later leverage in his work at the Voice of America. Scarcely 2 months after leaving the Army, he was interviewing Duke Ellington and his entourage at WWDC Studios, along with many other top names at the time, including Stan Kenton, Peggy Lee, George Shearing. These interviews, recorded to 16-inch records, are also available in the UNT Digital Library. Here are some more photos from the collection. And the misspelling Canover haunted him throughout his life. And here is a short-lived mustache, as well as a staged photo acting out a newspaper headline. The Navy shaking up the big brass. Conover's varied work duties continued, both sublime and ridiculous, and he developed a persona known as the gentleman jockey, which involved some fancy formal wear, though long pants were negotiable on at least one occasion. Meanwhile, he branched out as a concert promoter in DC, and helped to integrate the DC club scene by obtaining assurances that no one of any skin color would be turned away if they were properly dressed for the event. He did agree not to advertise in the Washington Afro-American newspaper, but with that, he leveraged the highly visible and publicly impactful concession by club owners to allow integrated audiences, who of course had other means of finding out about the concerts. Conover also once personally accompanied Billie Holiday to see Art Tatum perform in an otherwise segregated club. Even then, the club owner was so stubborn that they were only allowed to stay for one set and they couldn't have any drinks. So remarkable was Conover's continued friendship with Ellington that he was even invited to go on tour with the band for about 2 weeks in 1949. Conover's many pages of locations, repertory, and anecdotes about Ellington and other band members behind the scenes. Importantly, his notes also fill in information missing from discographical evidence and the indispensable database of the Duke, Where and When regarding the band's appearances in Peterborough, Ontario, and Quebec City. Conover's nickname, the Gentleman Jockey, appears here at least as a working tune title from an Ellington recording session. The issue number penciled in next to Joog Joog, here Choog Choog, matches the recording session from December 22nd, 1949, as do On the Sunny Side of the Street and The World is Waiting for the Sunrise. The two other titles from that session are Good Woman Blues, which may correspond to the ballad by Hibbler printed on the label, leaving B-sharp Boston introduced around that time as a possible match for the published title of what was the Gentleman Jockey here. I haven't heard this recording to confirm because it is one that does not reside in UNT's collection. I found it on a research fellowship to the Rutgers Institute of Jazz Studies in 2019 and hope to hear it when it can be safely played back and recorded. Another major side project for Conover was the Orchestra of Washington, D.C. Conover explained in a 1983 Washington Post article that musicians who had toured with acts like Buddy Rich and Glenn Miller wanted to continue to play in a big band after returning to D.C. Since Conover did not play an instrument, the billing for the show read, Willis Conover presents the Orchestra of Washington, D.C. The orchestra's sound is preserved in several recordings in the UNT Digital Library, one full-length album, and one EP record. Their progress was thwarted by leader Joe Timer's untimely death. The reference to House of Sounds on the album and several later programs and events that Conover hosted comes from his science fiction background, specifically from the title of a short story by M.P. Shiel. The orchestra performed at Club Cavacus and hosted numerous guest stars, including Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell, and Charlie Parker. Arranger Bill Potts had the foresight to record many performances, several of which were commercially released decades later. Conover even tried his hand at the novel medium of television, appearing on WNBW, which is now the NBC affiliate WRC. With that, he became a historical footnote in an early congressional morals inquiry into radio and television programming. As a subcommittee of the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee listened, one witness's laundry list of offenses included some very low necklines on the Willis Conover show, dropped almost off the shoulders. It is not clear how aware Conover was of these complaints, as they came up in searches of secondary sources. But a series of photo prints I couldn't help but include might capture his reaction if he were aware. Conover's personal network in radio and in music was considerable, but he still encountered major setbacks. His second marriage was ending. He lost $12,000 in a 1953 concert promotion, equivalent to over $117,000 adjusted for inflation, and he lost his sponsor, Ballantine Ale, at WWDC. He was informed his contract would not be renewed, and he took a job at WEAM in Arlington, Virginia, which he detested so intensely that he didn't even like to mention the station by name. But it was a conversation he overheard by chance at WEAM that changed his life. The Voice of America was hiring a jazz broadcaster. Here, it's worth pausing from Conover's story to look at the history of jazz programming at the Voice of America. Programming schedules at the U.S. National Archives, from before Music USA began, show sporadic jazz offerings. The Library of Congress Sonic Database lists a VOA jazz program featuring Count Basie in October of 1945. Willis Conover himself, misspelled here as Willis Conover, participated in at least one of the early jazz offerings on the VOA in 1949, in a program called American Jazz that focused on Duke Ellington and featured Conover's remarks in English, followed by another speaker reading a translation to Swedish. That's shown in the middle of this slide, between two other 16-inch records of jazz programming from the VOA at the Rutgers Institute of Jazz Stories. And my thanks to Dan Morgenstern for alerting me to the content there. The first comparable series of programs appears to have been critic and author Leonard Feather's program, Jazz Club USA. Author Ian Anderson notes that it was music director Harold Boxer who invited Feather to produce the programs, though it received no special or targeted promotion and scarcely lasted 2 years, from 1950 to around 1952. It is unclear why the program ended, but it set a precedent. And American diplomats in the Soviet Union noted it had a following there. Perhaps its demise was a missed opportunity. In 1954, however, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Charles Bolin, informed the VOA that a jazz program would have a large potential audience in the Soviet Union, the result of which was Music USA. Despite his prior VOA work, Treasury broadcasts, and his cachet as a DC radio personality, Conover was not the first choice for the job. That was Ray Michael, a competent broadcaster, but a specialist in sports rather than jazz. Conover was initially assigned the weekend shows, but Ray Michael's other commitments were such that Conover took over weekday shows by spring of 1955, bringing encyclopedic knowledge, warmth, enthusiasm, and interviews with top names in jazz. The program was initially 2 hours long, with an hour of light popular music introduced with Neil Hefti's Coral Reef, and then the jazz hour. Both hours were later shortened to 45 minutes to accommodate a news break to capitalize on the size of the audience that was tuning in. Along with Ray Michael, several other co-hosts covered weekends through 1961. After Ray Michael came Bill Sari, Paul Norton, and Wayne Hyde. Thanks to a website called the Blue Danube Network, located in Austria, I was able to find a recording of Ray Michael, the only one I've found so far, and I thought it important we should hear his voice as part of the history of Music USA.
Everywhere. These have been 2 hours of music sent your way with every good wish from all of us here in the United States. I'm Ray Michael in the Washington studios of the Voice of America, reminding all of you that we have a date tomorrow night and every night of the week at this time for Music USA. This is the Voice of America radio station in Tangier.
Meanwhile, Music USA under Conover quickly proved Bolin right, as evidenced by a tremendous influx of fan mail and a black market trade in the recordings of Conover's program in the Soviet Union, sometimes even recorded on discarded X-ray film. The existence of an audience for the program was not a lucky guess on Bolin's part, but the product of experience going back as far as the 1930s, pointing to a pre-existing audience for jazz in the Soviet Union. As the death of Stalin signaled a relaxation of some restrictions in the Soviet Union, as Frederick Starr notes, a spontaneous proliferation of jazz bands between 1955 and 1958. Thus, there was not only an audience of passive listeners, but a growing body of active practitioners. Those active practitioners set up one last crucial element of success. People listening to the program took what they heard, made it their own, made something new, and shared it back. That is successful cultural exchange in action, and Conover inspired generations of international jazz musicians, including Adam Makowicz from Poland, Arturo Sandoval and Paquito de Rivera from Cuba, and Gabor Szabo from Hungary. His carefully crafted programs and warm, sincere delivery gained and kept a following, and his slow and deliberate manner of speaking made him an international English tutor as well as a jazz expert. The strength of these connections is visible in a program that was rushed into production in November of 1956. A group of jazz musicians in Budapest, Hungary, secretly recorded a set of songs and sent them specifically to Willis Conover via the US Embassy there. Shortly thereafter, the Hungarian uprising of 1956 occurred and was violently suppressed by pro-Soviet forces. In the aftermath of the uprising, it was unknown whether those musicians were even alive. Conover not only played their recordings, but brought in top jazz musicians and critics to comment. The UNT Music Library was able to restore a clean, digitized copy of this recording to the embassy and the musicians who made it on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the uprising in 2016. 60 years later, these bonds still mattered. In general, Conover avoided discussing either domestic or international politics on his program, but this recording also shows one of few overtly political moments, as Conover honors the revolutionaries as freedom fighters. Here is some audio from that program, edited slightly for time. With the intro, of course.
Voice of America Jazz Hour. Willis Conover speaking from Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to hear some jazz recordings never before broadcast. Jazz by Hungarians, recorded a few weeks ago, just before the freedom fight broke out in Hungary. This group of jazz enthusiasts, young men, most of them, and mostly amateur musicians, met together in a studio in Budapest and recorded some jazz of their own. Their inspiration was the American jazz musicians they had heard on Music USA. And today you will hear some of these American musicians as they comment on the performances of those young Hungarians. We don't know whether the musicians who made this music are able to listen today, nor even where they may be as we broadcast their music. But here for the world is their living testimonial in the universal language of music.
As noted earlier, Conover leveraged his extensive personal and professional network at the beginning of his work on Music USA to bring a parade of star power to the programs, including Art Tatum, Billy Taylor, Marion McPartland, George Shearing, Chet Baker, Duke Ellington, Dave Brubeck, and Louis Armstrong. You'll hear a lot more about Brubeck and Armstrong later today. These early interviews are listed in the National Recording Registry. I had the privilege of providing the explanatory essay that accompanies it, and I included a directory of known interviews, whether a copy has been located, and if it is available online. As for online access, in 2015, the UNT Music Library received a Grammy Foundation grant that allowed us to digitize the oldest tape recordings in our Conover collection, and we've since added dozens of 16-inch radio transcription discs from Conover's work in DC. You can find the collection in the UNT Digital Library by Googling UNT space MLCC. Conover's program prepared the ground and helped build fan communities overseas for State Department-sponsored tours. And in 1959, Conover made his first of dozens of overseas tours, where he was enthusiastically welcomed. On that first visit to Poland in 1959, Conover recalled seeing a crowd when the plane landed. He thought someone important must be on the plane, and it turned out the crowd was for him. This photo is from the Tallinn Jazz Festival in Estonia in 1967, which was a watershed moment for the acceptance of jazz in the Soviet Union, following the struggle to allow Charles Lloyd to perform there for a live audience. You'll also hear much more later today about jazz diplomacy and Conover's influence. Conover remained an independent contractor at the Voice of America for the duration of his 41 years of hosting Music USA, foregoing the benefits of health insurance and pension to retain independent control over the programs. Conover often appeared to be in precarious financial shape, whether due to taxes or multiple divorces, and this arrangement also allowed him to take on side projects without potential restrictions on dual employment. In Conover's case, dual employment alone would be a slow day. He wrote liner notes and magazine articles, appeared on television, did voiceovers for films, emceed the Newport Jazz Festival and other festivals, and hosted a radio program on WCBS in New York, again named the House of Sounds. He even launched a recording career as a spoken word artist and songwriter with CBS, releasing a few records. Conover told Billy Taylor that his first involvement in jazz at the White House was providing background information for Dave Brubeck's appearance there in 1964. It was the first of many, the most notable of which was Duke Ellington's 70th birthday party at the White House in April of 1969. I've covered Conover's earlier years in more detail because that's where the greatest gap in existing literature and accessible resources has been. For more on Conover in the 1960s, I encourage everyone to check out Mark Breckenridge's dissertation, Sounds for Adventurous Listeners, available in the UNT Digital Library. Through the 1970s, Conover got to see the fruits of his labors multiply and was awarded a medal for the Order of Merit of the Polish Ministry of Culture in the late 1970s and Downbeat Magazine's Lifetime Achievement Award in 1995. He also continued side projects, promoting a series of jazz concerts at the Town Hall in New York. And in a band project similar to that of the Orchestra of Washington, D.C., he also backed Bill Berry's New York band. Still, as Breckenridge's dissertation details, Conover's success was not without its challenges, especially in disputes with critics Holly West and Frank Kofsky, and his contractor status at the Voice of America was always inherently precarious. Conover kept his own political views a closely held secret. Surely that was partly on principle and partly out of self-preservation, so he would not be seen as a political figure to be moved along with the next administration. Many anecdotes exist about Conover tending toward paranoia, understandable given the nature of his contract work, as well as the spycraft that accompanied the Cold War. For several decades until his death, he maintained a mailbox at Roslyn Station in Arlington, Virginia, rather than give out his residential addresses, either in the greater DC area or his New York residence on Central Park West. This event is only the latest to testify to Conover's enduring legacy and the continuing interest in his life and work. I like to say that his story is like a thread running through the history of jazz after the Second World War. Here, just to drive the point home, is a visualization of Conover's personal network, people he interviewed, corresponded with, and so on. This comes from social networks and archival context, the SNAC project, which I'm pleased to be a contributor to, and where you can browse Conover's second and third degree connections, as well as numerous archival resources that contain Conover-related materials. And that brings us to Conover's collections. This is a basic list of where Conover and related collections reside. You'll be hearing a lot more about the National Archives later, as well as about materials in the Louis Armstrong House Museum. Processing Conover's collection here at UNT and finding documentation of various recordings and projects has created a sort of treasure map, a way of asking, this happened, does some tangible record of it exist somewhere? Our own collection, Conover's personal archive, arrived in 1997, a gift of the Willis Conover Jazz Preservation Foundation, which handled Conover's estate due to the lack of any heirs or descendants. Of the music library's over 140 special collections, Conover's is our largest collection from an individual. Fittingly, our larger collections involve actual radio stations. Conover kept things he was proud of, and they exist as an autobiography told in documents and artifacts. There will always be more to describe with this collection, but as you can see, the discoveries in the collection have been a considerable return. And so with that, I'll wrap up this presentation and we'll get ready for a great slate of speakers from across the United States. But before I go, there are numerous people to thank, and I dedicate this presentation particularly to Marie Ciliberti, Conover's coworker at VOA for over 30 years, who was a tireless advocate for preserving and continuing his legacy. We met via the Willis Conover fan page on Facebook, and she became a good friend whom I'd visit whenever I could on my trips to Washington, starting in 2015. She introduced me to many more wonderful people, many of whom are included on the list below. And with that, my sincere thanks go to my supervisors and library administration for their support, my colleagues, fellow jazz researchers, fellow Conover fans and music lovers, parents, and all of you who tuned in today.